All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Kris. This is Battle of Vincennes, George Rogers Clark, Story Behind the Symbol, Episode 1. Saw this on my feed and instantly subscribed to the channel so I wouldn't forget it. The Flag Lady, 298 subscribers. So give that a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like to. But this is going to be about the George Rogers Clark flag. I didn't know he had a flag, but the capture of Fort Sackville in Vincennes, Indiana. Anyways, that's the monument behind it. When I went there, and the outline is like this is where the fort was. But what's funny is when I went there, the day that I went there, the bunker, the basement was open, but it's a giant nuclear bomb fallout shelter bunker kind of thing. It was they were like, yeah, this is a special day, we just have it open. It was November 16th 2019. So they had they just took you into the bunker. Nothing special about the fallout shelter. Nothing special about it. It was kind of unfinished. It was just really weird. Anyways, let's get into this. Let's see if he talks about the battle at all.
February 1779. American and British forces are now into the fourth year of a conflict that the British thought would already be over. The battles fought in the northern colonies have come to a bloody stalemate, with the Americans winning key contests for control of much of the north. Their resources depleted, the British shift their focus to new areas in the American colonies that would allow them to mount a brutal counteroffensive. That brings us here to Fort Sackville in Vincennes, Indiana, and this flag, which is a symbol of that battle today. Success for the British meant almost certain defeat for the Americans. The stakes had never been higher. I'm Harrison Watson, and this is the story behind the symbol. America was built on the backs of the brave. Men and women who fought and died to create the land that you see today. Some fought to give birth to a new nation. Others settled and tamed new lands that would help define what our nation would become. Behind each of these moments in our history, symbols arose to rally, motivate, and unite people around a common cause. Symbols that defined our past to help guide our future. Generations of people fought and died under the banner of these symbols for their right to shape the future. Now we're retelling these stories as they've never been told before. This is the story behind the symbol. I'm standing in front of George Rogers Clark National Historic Park along the Wabash River in Vincennes, Indiana. As far as historians know, this is the official site of Fort Sackville, where American and British forces met in battle in the winter cold of 1779. But before we dive into that battle, we need to first understand why winning that battle was so important. All right, so to go over this next section and kind of teach you the lay of the land, everything that's going on, we're actually going to take a look at a map. Now, the map that I originally wanted to use was a time period proper map. Here's that map now. You can see that the way that the United States looks now really isn't what it looked like back then. For instance, the entire area that we're talking about right now, which is Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, all of that territory, including all the way over to Virginia on the East Coast, was Virginia. But so that we can kind of pay attention to all of this, I'm going to use a more modern map so that everybody can kind of know where things were back then and where that translates to today. So now we're going to dive into that, but I just wanted to tell you. All right, so you can take a look at the main map overlay that we have right here. And as you can see, the more modern map is overlaid. The areas in blue that are above, modern day Virginia and West Virginia, that New England area, that's where all the main fighting was taking place originally. That's where the stalemate had taken place. And so now we have a situation in which the British need to figure out, all right, what's next? So they have two options. Go west, as you see here in yellow, or go south, as you see here in red. Now, those areas are the places that they went. Basically, the hope was that if they went south, they might be able to split the colonies in two. And if they went west, they already had outposts that were in the west, including up in Detroit and the areas that we're going to be talking about in the Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois Valley area. Then, again, it was Virginia. But Vincennes, Indiana is the place that we're talking about today. So the idea behind this was, if they could control these two areas, which was south and west of the East Coast, they also had all of their ships along the seaboard. They could essentially retool, come back, and kind of put a stranglehold on the East Coast and bring them into submission. And the modern day United States as we know it today may have never come to be. So those are the stakes for the battle in the West. With so much at stake, gaining control of the West was vital to American prosperity, but that wasn't going to be easy. Americans had been settling west of the Appalachian Mountains since at least the mid-1700s, but they weren't the only people with claims to those lands. All right, so let me break this down for you. This whole area that we're talking about has basically been a powder keg of conflict since the middle 1700s. The French and the English both tried to lay claim to these lands, and they even fought a war over it called the French and Indian War. The Native Americans who had been living in the area well before any Europeans ever stepped foot on the continent, they were caught in the middle of it and they had to pick sides. On top of that, you had the American settlers that were starting to push west, and they were laying claims to these lands as well. Vincennes, Indiana is literally in the crosshairs of all of this. Well, the French lost the French and Indian War, and they gave control of most of the lands that we're talking about to the British. On top of that, by the end of the French and Indian War, the Americans and British were basically already butting heads. Though it hadn't broken out into all-out war just yet, the British started using their native allies to start attacking the American settlers who had come over from the east. In fact, Henry Hamilton, a British officer who's going to be a big portion of the story that we have.
So I just want to go back to that picture. So how common is it to see a man riding a horse with giant antlers? I gotta say, this is another. Oh, and look, it looks like a woman. So, yeah, this has got to be another artificial intelligence. What is with this? What is this? What are you firing, sir? Is that a missile? What's happening right now? And this guy right here looks like a pirate. I don't know what's happening. But I love it. I need more of this. This is Blackbeard right here. All right. Okay, back to the video.
East. In fact, Henry Hamilton, a British officer who's going to be a big portion of the story that we have to tell here today, he was the one who was actually ordering these attacks on American colonists. So all of this tension that's taking place was not only a catalyst for what would become the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolutionary War, but it was also a catalyst for George Rogers Clark's campaign in the West. In late 1777, 1 year into America's war for independence from the British, and with tensions flaring in the West, George Rogers Clark traveled to Williamsburg, Virginia, the capital of the Commonwealth, to meet with Governor Patrick Henry and a small group of trusted individuals to discuss his plan to take on the British and their Patrick Henry and a small.
So, I believe that they said that this church, which there are people buried behind him, Martha Washington's father or grandfather used to preach here. And then this is the governor's mansion. And if you go inside, there's all kinds of weapons just crisscross, and this is a big bowling green. And when I went there in February of 21, there were, as I was leaving, people were sitting in this big bowling green having lunch. Colonial Williamsburg is it's quite a trip. If you get a chance to go there, go.
Group of trusted individuals to discuss his plan to take on the British and their native allies in the West. His plan was to recruit 500 men to loose the grip of the British in the West, and with this force, to strike 3 British strongholds in the West, Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes. In taking these 3 forts, 2 on the Mississippi River and Vincennes on the Wabash River, he believed that these were the key to taking over Fort Detroit, the stronghold from which Henry Hamilton had been ordering the attacks on American settlers. Armed with the necessary authorizations from the Virginia government to conduct the campaign, and with the promise of aid to help the campaign be successful, George Rogers Clark set off from Williamsburg, Virginia, to Fort Pitt to begin recruitment for the daring journey. However, due to the war efforts in the east, instead of the 500 men he had planned to recruit, Clark was only able to attract 150 men for his mission. While this was far less than originally planned, the Kentucky militia promised to send another 200 men to meet him on the falls of the Ohio River at Corn Island to join in on the efforts. With the promise of these men, George Rogers Clark set out from Fort Pitt to the falls of the Ohio River and Corn Island, a journey close to 700 miles that they achieved in just a couple weeks. When they arrived, only 26 of the promised 200 Kentucky militia were there to greet him, bringing his total force to just 176 men. While it was a small army, they were experienced, and some of the frontier's most elite fighters, including Captain Leonard Helm, Joseph Bowman, and Simon Kenton. All three of these men had fought alongside George Rogers Clark in Lord Dunmore's War just a few years earlier in 1774. After months of training on Corn Island, Clark and his force were ready for battle. They left the falls of the Ohio and traveled down the Ohio River to Fort Massac in Illinois. From there, they left on foot, not wanting to be caught by the British on the Mississippi River, 125 miles northwest to Kaskaskia to begin their siege. On July 4th, 1778, Clark's force arrived at Kaskaskia and set out a plan to take the town during the night. He split his force in two, the first surrounding the town, while Clark and the remainder of the force would head into the town and take control of it. Just 15 minutes into the skirmish, the town had been captured without a single shot fired. The town was full of French citizens who had since sworn allegiance to the British following the end of the French and Indian War. However, in speaking with the townspeople, it was clear that the picture painted by the British about the Americans was a farce. As such, the French townspeople took a liking to Clark and his men. After taking Kaskaskia, Joseph Bowman and a small group set off immediately to capture Cahokia. By July 6, 1778, Bowman had taken Cahokia. At the same time that this was taking place, Clark sent a new ally, in Father Pierre Guibault, to Vincennes to convince the town to surrender to Clark on favorable terms, citing the proper treatment and reception that they had received back at Kaskaskia themselves. The people of Vincennes agreed, and Father Guibault returned to Kaskaskia to inform George Rogers Clark that Vincennes was also his. By July of 1778, all three main objectives had been taken without so much as a single shot fired.
Just a side note, this bridge right here is dedicated to the Lincoln, it might be the Lincoln Memorial Bridge or something like that. But this is not the bridge, but this bridge is in place where Lincoln's family crossed from Indiana into Illinois. And that's the Wabash River right there.
Command posts were set up. Everything seemed good. And while taking them without a fight was possible, keeping them without one would be another story. In October of 1778, word reached British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton at Detroit about the capture of Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes. Determined to not let these key locations slip through British fingers, Hamilton swiftly planned a counteroffensive. He gathered a mixed force of regular troops, French, Canadian volunteers, and Native American allies. As winter loomed, Henry Hamilton led his force south in a daring move to reclaim Vincennes before the harsh winter weather could halt their march. Braving the early chills of winter, Hamilton and his forces pressed on, reaching Vincennes in December of 1778. The town, lightly defended and surprised by the British arrival, fell quickly back under British control. Hamilton, believing that the American threat was mitigated and the harsh winter would deter any further American advances, he decided to garrison Fort Sackville with a small force. He dismissed many of his native allies, asking them to return in the spring. It was a decision he presumed would secure the fort until then. However, George Rogers Clark was not one to be easily deterred. Even as Hamilton fortified his positions at Vincennes, Clark was preparing for an audacious winter campaign that would soon challenge the British hold on the region. In January of 1779, it was this man, Francis Vigo, who had come to tell George Rogers Clark about the capture of Fort Sackville by the British. Clark immediately gave the order to begin preparations to retake Fort Vincennes, or Fort Sackville in Vincennes. But the problem was, to do so meant that they would have to traverse ice-cold waters in a mostly flooded Wabash River. But if they didn't strike now, Clark knew that in the spring, the British would be coming for them and they would be facing almost certain defeat. In the harsh winter of 1778, as British forces settled into Fort Sackville at Vincennes, confident in their control, George Rogers Clark refused to let the season deter his resolve. He planned a daring recapture, understanding that surprise and audacity were his greatest allies. In February 1779, Clark led a small but determined force of around 170 men on a grueling march across the flooded plains of Illinois. The journey was perilous, with waters at all times chest deep, threatening to chill them to the bone and worse. Despite the severe conditions, Clark's men pressed on, their spirits buoyed by their leader's unyielding determination. After days of enduring the freezing waters and mud, they arrived outside of Vincennes, catching the British garrison completely off guard. Their treacherous journey is now over. They've made it to the banks of the Wabash, right by Fort Sackville. The time is now to take back the fort. But how? Using the element of surprise and psychological warfare, Clark demanded the surrender of Fort Sackville. His small force made such a show of strength that Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton, commanding the fort, believed he was outnumbered. On February 25, 1779, after a brief siege, Hamilton surrendered Fort Sackville back to the Americans. Clark's audacious winter campaign not only regained the fort, but also significantly boosted American morale and secured the frontier for the American cause.
I'm not upset. But he left out maybe he just doesn't want to talk about it, but he left out the slaughter that he did to the Native Americans that were there, which then prompted the British the following day to give up the fort. And you don't have to talk about it. You know, it's fine. This is a recap. But he also left out they didn't fire a shot to take over Kaskaskia, which they didn't, but he took the fort and then he fired on the town for like a day or two. And then he went into town and convinced everyone that he was the savior. And he made it look like the British had done that. But it was 2 days getting the British soldiers out of there. And he said, oh, we saved everyone. He left that part out. Unless that story is no longer accurate. But I heard that at Vincennes. So I don't know.
The daring efforts of a young man at age only 26 would change not only the course of American history, but help define what would become the American Midwest. The West would no longer be a safe haven from which the British could control trade or retool their forces for a counteroffensive in other areas of the Revolutionary War. While the British would hold on to Fort Detroit until the end of the war, they were kept at bay because of the daring efforts of George Rogers Clark and his ragtag team of daring soldiers. The symbol that represents the bravery of George Rogers Clark still flies all over the town of Vincennes, Indiana today, as a constant reminder and an homage of the men who helped secure not only their future, but the future of the United States as we know it today. I'm Harrison Watson, and that's the story behind this symbol. We'll see you next time.
Okay, so he's telling more about this. He's probably not getting into dirty details. That's okay. He's more focusing on the flag, and that's fine. I get that. You don't need those details when you're going to tell, the story, but you're telling it differently. That's fine. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. I did. So I'm going to go ahead and end this here, but we will be back with another video. Until then, have a good day. Have a good night.